I hope the screen share is working okay. So I would like to warmly thank the organizers of this conference, and in particular, the late Barbara Chopek-Kopciu, for inviting me to deliver one of the plenary lectures at this conference. It's truly unfortunate that we can't all be together in person, especially as Krakow is such a wonderful city, and I was looking forward to being there again, along with all my onomastic friends and colleagues, and spending a wonderful week together. But it seems that will have to wait a few years. ICOS certainly is the largest gathering in the world for onomastic scholars, which is why this is the best possible venue for what I hope to accomplish today. In brief, most research and publication in onomastics today relates to Europe or to North America. There are, of course, good historical and cultural reasons for this, but it does lead to many other areas of the world being comparatively neglected, even invisible, in onomastic research. I'm speaking of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and to a large extent, even Australasia. My goal then is to give you something of an overview of names in one of these neglected areas, India, home to 1.4 billion people, just over 1/6 of humanity, both with some history as well as contemporary trends, which include decolonization and other cultural trends covering both place names and personal names in this extremely diverse country. This is overly ambitious, of course, for the time allotted today, so please accept the following as merely scratching the surface and as an attempt to interest others in the names of India. There are, of course, many other areas I simply cannot cover, including more theoretical work on decolonization and on renaming more generally. On renaming due to regime change or indigenization, some mention of every Indian state, all 28 of them, and 8 union territories, or major language group, nor the significant Indian diaspora abroad and the considerable cultural interactions that that inevitably brings. For excellent studies of Indian personal naming patterns and their evolution in the diaspora, there's a paper by Rajan Mestri on South Africa and Tilakavavati Shanmuganathan on the Telugu in Malaysia, and I will be showing references at the end of this talk. By way of a brief itinerary for our journey today, here's my order of topics: history, the colonial era, decolonization as seen through the renaming of cities and streets, the interaction of religion and caste in personal naming, a few examples of naming patterns, and then concluding with some recent name-relevant items from the Indian media. In order to understand some of the complexity and diversity of India, I will need to begin with a brief overview of some history, North versus South, and other regional differences, ethnic and linguistic groups, for example, Indo-European versus Dravidian, which correlates highly with North versus South. There are also religions, caste, and so on. There is huge diversity in climate and topography. There's huge cultural variety in dress, even, for example, the details of how you drape a sari, variations in food, house style, and so on. So on the next slide, you can see some basic demographic facts. Of great importance for names and naming patterns and name changes are religions and languages. There are 6 major religions in contemporary India, 4 of which originated on the Indian subcontinent. In decreasing order of size, these 6 are Hinduism, Islam, Christianity in various sects, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Jainism. In addition, there is the world's largest number of Parsis or Zoroastrians, together with a dwindling Jewish community, Baha'is, and various native animistic religions. The official language situation is a bit more complicated. In British India, prior to independence in 1947, English was the administrative language and the only language used in higher education. Upon independence in 1947, despite bitter contestation, English was retained as a national language, initially only until 1965 and later extended for practical purposes indefinitely. The attitude towards English has varied tremendously over the years, and for those who wish to know more, I recommend Mukherjee 2009. Hindi is the official language of the union or national government. Hindi is widely spoken across northern India, acts as a lingua franca across much of India, and is widely taught in schools throughout India. There are 22 official languages, so Hindi plus 21. of differing regional status. English is called an additional official language and is used nationwide. The official languages are listed on the slide, and I need not read them out to you, but important for us is that they split into two main language groups, Indo-European in the north, Dravidian in the south. There are also languages from the Sino-Tibetan and Austroasiatic families, including as official languages, and many non-official languages and dialects. The state boundaries largely coincide with linguistic boundaries. The 2001 census has 31 languages with over 1 million native speakers, and if some dialects considered separate languages by many are separated out, there are approximately 60 languages with over 1 million native speakers. As for history, there is obviously too much to say, so I'll be brief and just hit some highlights, the ones that are relevant for naming. You will see a lot of facts and names go by, many of which I hope you recognize from high school history or general reading. We can begin with the Indus Valley civilization with the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, now both in Pakistan, and also Lothal near Ahmedabad in modern Gujarat. There were nomadic tribes who cultivated crops and domesticated animals. An urban culture emerged around 3500 before the Christian era, peaking around 2600 to 1700 before the Common Era. This was roughly in the area of modern Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Sindh, which is now in Pakistan. There was trade with Mesopotamia. The decline of this Indus Valley civilization began from the beginning of the second millennium BCE with various theories of either floods or decreased rainfall interfering with agriculture or Aryan invasions, and Arya is from the Sanskrit word for noble. Our word India itself is derived from Indus, which is derived ultimately from Sanskrit Sindhu, the historic local name for the Indus River. The Greeks referred to the Indians as Indoi, the people of the Indus. The modern Indian constitution and usage in many of the current languages of India also recognizes Bharat as an official name of equal status to India. The name Bharat is derived from the name of the legendary king Bharata in Hindu scriptures. Hindustan, originally a Persian word for land of the Hindus, generally refers to North India and Pakistan before independence in 1947. It's occasionally, but increasingly rarely used now as a synonym for all of India. From around 1500 BCE, there were Aryan or Indo-European arrivals into North India, into the fertile basin of the Indus and Ganges rivers. With respect to language, this was the era of Sanskrit, the Prakrits, and the various vernaculars, so the parent languages of Hindi and the languages of North India. These population movements are what caused the Dravidian speakers to move further south. It was during the time of the Vedas, the Hindu sacred scriptures, 1500 to 1200 BCE, that the caste system became formalized. And the caste system is very important for naming, as we will see later. There were a number of invasions that tried to conquer India but didn't succeed. I mention these only to show that India and knowledge of India was once more widespread, particularly in the ancient world, than those of us who learned our history in North America or Europe generally realize. Darius the Great, king of Persia, annexed Punjab and Sindh, but got no further. Alexander the Great invaded in 326 BCE, but did not go beyond the Bias River, where his armies in effect mutinied rather than march further to the east and take on the Nanda Empire. A series of dynasties and kings followed. For lack of time, I will simply display some names and details on the slide. So on to the next slide. Meanwhile, in religion, there was the rise of Buddhism in Bodh Gaya and nearby Sarnath, very close to Varanasi, and of Jainism, both around 500 BCE, both questioning the Vedas and critical of the caste system. These religions never spread widely in India, and especially not in southern India, although Emperor Ashoka took Buddhism to Sri Lanka. Throughout all this period, there was trade with the Egyptians, with the Roman Empire, both overland and through southern ports. spices, pearls, ivory, and silk in return for Roman gold. Much of this was in the extreme south in Kerala, but some also on the east coast. So for example, Arikamedo, a few kilometers south of Pondicherry, traded with the Romans in the 1st century BCE. There was trade overland with China and with Southeast Asia. 2,000 years ago, Jews from the Holy Land came to Kochi in Kerala, and in 800 to 1200 of the Common Era, there were Arab, Swahili-speaking traders from East Africa coming to Kerala. Discounting theories that Jesus spent the lost years between his youth and the start of his ministry at approximately age 30 in India, in Kashmir, maybe elsewhere, and somewhat inspired by Buddhism, Christianity arrived possibly with St. Thomas the Apostle in 52 of the Common Era, but certainly Christianity arrived at least no later than with Thomas Kana, a Syrian Christian merchant who came in the 4th century with 400 families to Kerala, and they remained. Over a millennium later, St. Francis Xavier also came for 3 years and is in fact buried in Goa. The beginnings of the more modern period coincide with the era of European exploration and colonialism. Just before that, there were Muslim invasions into North India from the northwest. Chauhan lost Delhi to Muslim invaders in 1192, and by 1200, pretty much the whole of North India was under Muslim control. They defended the empire from Mongol invasion in the 1200s. Delhi was conquered by Tamerlane in 1398. Babur became the first Mughal emperor after conquering Delhi in 1526. There were brief recaptures of Delhi, but basically it remained Mughal until falling to the British in 1857. The alliance of Hindu kingdoms against the Muslim threat to South India led to the Vijayanagar Empire in Karnataka in the south. Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer who discovered the sea route from Europe to India, where Columbus failed by going in the wrong direction, arrived in Calicut in what is now Kerala in 1498 and began trading. In 1510, Portuguese forces under Alfonso de Albuquerque captured Goa. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of Britain granted the first trading charter to the East India Company. 1631 saw the beginning of the construction of the Taj Mahal in Agra by Shah Jahan in memory of his wife. He also constructed the Red Fort, a famous landmark in Delhi, and converted the Agra Fort into a palace. In 1674, Shivaji established the Maratha kingdom in Western India and parts of the Deccan and North India. He gave himself the title Chhatrapati, Lord of the Universe, which we will see later in renamings. The French had a much more minor presence beginning in 1642 in the area surrounding Pondicherry. After various British versus French battles and transfers, sometimes affected by the outcomes of wars in Europe and various treaties, the 5 remaining small French territories in India became fully part of India in 1954. Okay, then the British in Bengal became a major player. The first military victory of the East India Company was 1757. The Mughals continued to rule weakly until 1857 with the First War of Independence, meaning independence from Britain, also known as the Indian Uprising or the Indian Mutiny, which led to transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown. And that period then began the British Raj, with independence on August the 15th and partition, so India versus Pakistan, 1 day earlier, August 14th, 1947. Then in 1971, East Pakistan became Bangladesh, thus further fracturing the Indian subcontinent. So now let us turn to renaming and respelling of cities, streets within cities in the post-colonial era, which began in 47 as probably the first known and visible onomastic acts of decolonization in India to reach outside India and signal this new post-colonial era. There were actually very few changes in the first years after the end of the British Raj. Mostly these were street name changes, likely as those are less complicated to enact legally, and we'll come to that later. There were very few city or town name changes. The first in 1948 was Cawnpore to Kanpur, an important military station in British India, so there may also have been some symbolic value. It wasn't so much a change as a respelling to more accurately reflect actual Indian pronunciation rather than the British rendition of it. The first, more widely known change was in 1995, when Bombay, the capital of Maharashtra state, became Mumbai. A pro-Maratha regionalist movement, Shiv Sena, came to power in municipal elections a decade earlier and undertook this symbolic change. Although actual origins and etymologies are obscured, and there are many slightly different variants, it is usually said that the Portuguese named the settlement Bombaia, Good Bay, hence Bombay. And since the name was given by the Portuguese and taken over by the British, that made it a colonial name to be targeted for change. It is also said that the Koli fisher folk who were settled there named their settlement in Marathi, their language, after the Hindu goddess Mumba. One can't help but notice the phonetic similarity of Bombaia and Mumba and wonder about double and convergent etymology, possibly folk etymology, and so on. Note that many uses of Bombay rather than Mumbai persist even 25 years later. So for example, the airport, the prestigious engineering university is still the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. The various demonyms, Mumbaikar, Bombayite, and Mumbaiite show some variation. In 1996, Madras, the capital of Tamil Nadu, became Chennai. The British, specifically the East India Company, had founded a settlement at a fishing village called Madras Patnam in 1639. Even though the etymology is obscure, it's a Tamil name. From a fisherman Madarasan, or maybe from the local Muslim religious schools, the Madarasas, or from the name Mudirasa, which is one of several names of the person who gave the city to the British, or from Madhuras, from the Sanskrit and Tamil words for honey with no good explanation given. There is even another suggestion, not Tamil, but likely a folk etymology, that Madras itself also comes from Portuguese, Madre de Dios, Mother of God, referring specifically to a church in the city, Church of St. Mary. The origin of the name Chennai, ironically, is not Tamil, but rather Telugu, a related but definitely different Dravidian language. It comes from Damarla Mudirasa Chennappa Nayakudi, the Raj of Chandragiri, a Telugu speaker who granted the British the right to the trade of on the Coromandel coast. As with Bombay, Mumbai, many uses of Madras still persist. So again, the airport, the university, the Institute of Technology, and so on. Later, in 2001, we have Calcutta becoming Kolkata, which is simply a more phonetically accurate rendition of the Bengali, yet still is symbolic decolonization. And again, both usages persist. So for example, the universities, the airport, and so on. So similarly, Bangalore changed back to Bengaluru, a previous name, in 2006. And there's a legend about how it got its name. The British had renamed it to Bangalore in 1809. And again, it's an inaccurate rendition of native pronunciation. According to the most recent population figures, these four cities then that I've talked about, Mumbai, Bengaluru, Kolkata, and Chennai, are four of the 5 largest in India, and we'll come to Delhi later. So on this slide, I've also listed a number of other cities of lesser size, but which you may still have heard of. It's kind of interesting how, for example, Benares, which has spelling variants, became Varanasi, often pronounced Varanasi, in 1956. But in 2019, so very recently, the railway station has now been renamed back to Banaras. So a kind of undoing of that. The university, which is relatively prestigious, always returned Banaras. And when its engineering college became one of the prestigious IITs, Indian Institute of Technology, in 2012, it now has a very long official name, Indian Institute of Technology, Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, probably trying to keep the best of all of its brands. Okay, so you can read the rest on the slide. It's just really to show you that there are lots of examples, not to go through them all. So as you can see, some of what we've seen are quite recent, and clearly this is still ongoing. In fact, under the government of the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there are now many more proposed changes in line with the government's policy of promoting Hinduism, generally to the detriment of Muslims and India's Mughal heritage. One change of this most recent wave of changing Mughal names to Hindu names is Allahabad, a major city of well over 1.5 million, to Prayagraj, which took place in 2018. There is talk of changing Pune to Jijapur, and again, I won't read everything to you here. Hyderabad, very clearly identified as Muslim, Lucknow, and so on here. Ahmedabad, obviously also Muslim, but it's normally pronounced Ahmedabad or even Avdabad, and so it's not quite so obviously Muslim, but they want to change it to Karnavati. And Tiruvananthapuram, which originally was Trivandrum, they now want to change to Anantapuri, which must be for different reasons, unclear to me for one, because it's sometimes said maybe to be easier to pronounce for North Indians. But most stunning for all of these, Delhi, India's second largest city by population, and as you know, the national capital, they want to change to Indraprastha or Indraprastha city. So the city of the god of Indra, a name found in the ancient Sanskrit epic Mahabharata. There'll no doubt be a huge amount of pushback about that, so we'll see. Okay, renaming of streets. So turning now to street names, as I mentioned earlier, these were among some of the first renamings after independence, as the regulations and processes are far less complex. For all those cities named earlier, there was union, so federal level legislative approval, in some cases also state approval, and always local approval. For street names, municipal approval is all that's required. So for streets, there are colonial names that remain, some that have changed, and then others where the name has changed, but the old name is the one that's still used. So maps, whether official or unofficial, may be discrepant from local usage. And let me tell you from experience, more importantly, taxi driver usage. Here are some examples, and again, I won't read them all to you. Please refer to the slide. In Delhi, Connaught Place is now Rajiv Chowk, but the old name is far more common. Don't try to take a taxi to Rajiv Chowk. You will take your taxi to Connaught Place. And then some other examples there as well. In general, the renamings are to get rid of, an old colonial name, often with a person's name, but it can often be with say a town or a county in England, typically renamed to various local heroes of some form or another, or prominent politicians or leaders. So for example, the very first one on the street on the list there, we have Delhi, I mentioned, but then Ring Road is known as MG Road, now Mahatma Gandhi Road. Okay, so there are lots of examples of those, and you can see that most of them have changed into people's surnames. And just so we don't forget that Britain was not the only colonial master, Pondicherry, a former colony of France, also had street name changes after it became officially part of India. So for example, Rue Bussy became Lal Bahadur Shastri Street after the Prime Minister at the time. But for example, on maps, it's still Bussy Street in many cases. And if you in fact input Lal Bahadur Shastri Street, Google automatically takes you to Bussy Street with no mention of Shastri, but I mean, it must know it somewhere in the algorithm. Interestingly, there's a Guber Avenue, which is now renamed Beach Road and is in actual active use. The latter is interesting, this example, because it's decolonizing away from the language of the colonial master, so away from French, this being Pondicherry, but ironically to English, which is not seen as colonial in the Pondicherry context. It also has the advantage of being descriptive because it literally runs parallel to the beach. Some of the colonial era names were names of people directly associated with colonialism, particularly of governors, governors general, and viceroys. Many of these names will be familiar to those from other former British colonies like Canada, as governors often serve successively in more than one location. In many cases, the colonial era names were more generic, like things like Fort, Broadway, Southern, but they could also have been of towns, for example, or counties in Britain. All these types changed into names of local meaning or significance, most often personal names. Under the fervor of nationalism, but the impetus to decolonize, many of the major roads changed, not necessarily the minor ones, but they, as I mentioned, have still not died out for various different reasons. And in fact, you can still sometimes see multiple street signs, one part of a road, another part of a road, an older sign, a newer sign, and so on. I don't have a chance to talk about other types of renamings of buildings and institutions, but I'll just give a couple of well-known examples from Mumbai. The Victoria Terminus railway station, usually just called VT, has for some time been named Chhatrapati Shivaji after the Maratha leader in the 1600s, who also has the Bombay airport named after him. There's also the Prince of Wales Museum in Western India, which has now been named after him in part of Mumbai. And I also want to refer you to Louisa Caiazzo's 2017 American Name Society annual meeting presentation, which was on Indian university names and their colonial legacy. Her paper concentrates on different patterns of naming of universities before 1947 compared to after 1947. But of relevance for my topic here are some examples of universities founded before founded before independence in 47 that were renamed, such as Agra University, named after its town, founded in 1927, renamed in 1996 to Ambedkar University. Sagar University, founded in 46, so just a year before independence, renamed in 83 to Hari Singh Gaur University. But even so, the former name Sagar University is still most commonly used. So now I will turn to personal names. And just as a further comment on everything in this section, I do personally know someone with every single one of the names in this section, or else they are a well-known public personality. So there's been a type of verification around everything from personal experience. So crucial to the description of the personal naming system in India is a basic understanding of the role of religion and of caste. So I'm going to start with religion, and here your name, well, your first name here, often immediately reveals your religion. Your surname does as well, but this slide is about the personal given name. I won't read them all to you, obviously, but male given names. At the top, there's some examples there that are always Muslim, in many cases very popular outside India as well. Some male names are always Hindu, and there's a long list on the slide. So then there's some female names that are always Hindu, and again, a list on the slide. And some female names that are always Muslim. So again, it's not important to read through everything. It's just to show that very often you can tell by somebody's first name what their religion is. In Kerala, which is in the south of India, traditionally, the first son inherits the name of the paternal grandfather. The second son inherits the name of the maternal grandfather, and the third son inherits the name of the father. Similarly, the first daughter inherits the name of the paternal grandmother. The second daughter inherits the name of the maternal grandmother, and the third daughter inherits the name of the mother. If there are more children than that, names start coming from uncles and aunts. So again, there can be patterns even in the way that these names are assigned. Increasingly, many Indians, and I'm not speaking of the diaspora, where obviously it will be common, have Western sounding first names like Michelle or Natasha that also fit the sound system of their mother tongue well, or Western names like, for example, Sheila or Neil, which are very similar to native names. Other popular trends are to bestow personal names of popular film actors, and remember, the film industry is huge in India, or to invent first names by combining syllables from the parents' first names. Okay, now family names. So again, often by religion. Some surnames are always Muslim. There's examples on the slide for you. Some surnames are always Hindu. And again, on the slide. And typical of some of the intersecting factors at work in Indian names, some names might be either Hindu or Muslim, but always North. So for example, these two, in particular, Chowdhury, I think most of you will recognize as a common name. It has multiple different spellings, but it's a hereditary title of honor awarded by Mughals to eminent persons, typically landowners. And so that explains why it can be both Hindu or Muslim and was common in the North. In the Sikh religion, all females bear the name Kaur, princess, and all males bear the surname Singh, meaning lion, as an attempt to do away with caste. Many Sikhs now, though, bear a second surname, so that Kaur or Singh appears to westernize as a middle name. Common Sikh names are given there, and I give an example of how modern usage may appear. A first name, then Kaur, which tells you that it's a Sikh female, and then a common surname. There are many other examples where the family name is an ethnic or religious identifier. So for example, the Syrian Christians many minutes ago who came about 2,000 years ago, they're still there, and they have as frequent surnames ending in IAN. So for example, Cherian Kurian, very common, but also biblical names. And then there are some surnames which are always Christian at the bottom of the slide there. And then remember from the Portuguese times, there are names of Portuguese origin, and that reflects colonial legacy. All are Christian, and typically they are from the Goa area or further south into Kerala. I mentioned earlier caste, and I can't really go into details here, and time will prevent that, but it's an exceedingly complicated area, and there are many readable introductions to caste. There are also many unreadable introductions to caste, but one of the best is actually on the BBC website, and there's a reference in the references I'll show you later. The Indian Constitution actually prohibits discrimination based on caste, and there are any number of affirmative action policies, such as so-called reserved seats in government jobs and universities for some of the lower castes. So the Sanskrit word for caste is varna, meaning color, and there are 4 main castes, many subcastes, and that is on your slide. And then outside the caste system are the avarna, the ones without caste at the bottom. The Dalits are untouchables, but also the various tribal groups. And the top 3 castes there are about 15% of the population, so Brahmins, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, and that they've essentially ruled India for 3,000 years. At the bottom, the untouchables are about 20%. The remaining 15% of the population are from various other religions, and though even though caste doesn't actually pertain to other religions, so Christians and so on, Christians may nevertheless claim a caste, which may be based on ancestral considerations. So, you know, what was their family before conversion to Christianity? But it's also in order to take advantage of some of the incentives in affirmative action. The castes were often associated with an occupation as well. And by somebody's surname, you have a pretty good idea of what their caste actually was. Some of these also are good to know if you're reading Indian literature. So for example, you can get something like Agarwal, many variant spellings. These were the sweet makers. And it explains remarks that you find, such as, for example, in a recent Chetan Bhagat novel, somebody's introduced and his name is Agarwal, and then somebody else says, he's not nearly as sweet as you might think from his surname. A completely impossible reference if you don't understand the caste system. Okay, so moving on to the next. There are also names by profession and region and so on, and I thought I'd give an example of some really strange ones. That first set are actual Indian surnames. I'll explain in a moment. And then there are another set which may strike one as a little bit strange as well, with wala, which is a Hindi word suffix, which means a person employed in that particular industry or a person from a certain region. So you get some very strange names as a result, like Station Wala, which is the CEO of one of our local hospitals here, actually. So clearly these names originated after contact with Britain in the British Raj. There are some with place names, and it's interesting, there's Mumbai Wala, it's not Bombay Wala, it's Mumbai Wala. But also I thought you might be interested in that other last one, which is actually from an acronym, which is a little bit strange for a surname. And there are a few odd English-Hindi combinations in place names as well, and I list three there, all from the extreme north of India. MacLeodganj you might recognize because it's the location of the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama. Okay, so there are also names that are language or region specific rather than caste or religion. And so here are some examples, and again, I won't be reading them all to you. But it's just, again, to illustrate that when you know the name, you often know quite a bit about background. Okay, so again, I'll just leave that for a moment while you look. Not going to read it. Okay, and then another set around some of the rest of the country. Christians commonly have a baptismal name as well, so as a middle name following the kind of Western or Christian format, and that can complicate things perhaps as well. And so again, examples here by region or language background. We often find elements that recombine, so things like Lal for red, Singh for lion, Krishna, which is a major deity in the Hindu religion, and so on. And these can recombine in various ways. Okay, so just letting you take a look at that. Indian surnames, especially the Dravidian names from the south, can seem very long to non-Indians and even to North Indians. Sometimes the given names are also long, and it's common in India for initials to be used in normal everyday language. So for the entire name or just the first name or some other form of shortening. So for example, my York University colleague, Anantharaman Kumarakrishnan, is universally known as Kumar. And my late University of Ottawa colleague, Purushottam G. Patel, was always just PG. And I remember him telling me that his middle name was so long that he just never, ever used it, neither in India nor in Canada. He was always known as just PG. So this penchant for abbreviations is found with roads too. So for example, almost every city has an MG road. I showed you one example earlier. There are also surnames which refer directly to a town or region of origin, such as Puri, Bhutani, Mewari. Okay, a lot of regional variation in trends and trends that can be observed. So for example, in some areas, it's still normal to only have your given name and no surname, in which case, you know, different people in the family can end up adding different differentiators. So for example, this female wrestler who's been competing recently, her name is simply Jyoti, and she's sometimes listed as Jyoti of India, or she sometimes calls herself Jyoti Palwan after an Indian style of wrestling. In Tamil, Family names are not common, again, mostly just given names. People often have just their own personal name. And so take, for example, a prominent politician, Chidambaram. That's his entire name, but he's often referred to as P. Chidambaram, and people wonder what the P stands for. It actually stands for his father's name, Palaniappan, which is his father's sole name. So again, functioning as a type of differentiator based on the father's name. And what's interesting here is his wife, son, and granddaughter now use Chidambaram as a family name. So there's an example of change to a Western or North Indian pattern within a generation. So examples of traditional patterns. So for example, in Telugu, but it's true of much of South India. If you have a boy called Raman, son of Gopal, he will be G. Raman, and Raman, who's maybe son of Dinesh, will be D. Raman. Whereas Raman, D. Raman, but then either of those, let's say they have a son, it would be, or one of them has a son called Vijay, it will be R. Vijay, so for Raman Vijay. It gets interesting when you look at what girls do, of course, as well. So for women, it's different again. Before marriage, a female will use her father's initials. So Ananya, daughter of Gopal, will be G. Ananya. When she marries, for example, Vikram, she will be V. Ananya. So to Westerners, it looks as though she changed her first initial on marriage, not the family name. But contemporary social norms are changing this. And at least in some segments of society, if a woman works, she will tend to have all her diplomas in her pre-marriage name. And since changing a name is very cumbersome and bureaucratic in India, the modern trend is now simply to add the husband's name at the end. So Ananya may now be known as G. Ananya Vikram. So a Westerner or someone from North India might think her surname is Vikram, but it's actually her husband's given name. The even more modern trend of simply retaining the birth name is occasionally seen, but not really that common just yet. And I'll skip any further examples here, but just to mention that the problems associated with incompatibility with Western naming systems affect issues such as issuance of visa, other bureaucratic activities, but tracking of publications in academia. And there are some interesting recent articles about that very problem. And obviously, one should be watching for the trends here. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about a couple of contemporary issues. And these are taken from the Indian press, and there are things much talked about in India. So there's a very great social separation by caste and an absence of interaction between castes. Caste is often conveyed, as I said earlier, by the surname. So here's an example of an attempt to eradicate the immediate social problem of difficulty of interaction between different castes in what should be a neutral transactional situation. So in 2011, in a northern state in India, Himachal Pradesh, the police stopped using their surnames. So for example, on nameplates, name tags, how they address each other, in a force of 15,000 personnel to try to bring greater cohesiveness and a sense of equity. And this example is being discussed in a couple of other states as a good example of a way forward. There are also plenty of unusual and rather difficult names. And so a person by the name of Gananan Wamanacharya has taken it upon himself by forming a committee called Atnav Sudar Samiti to help people change their surnames. And remember that it's difficult to do this in India, very bureaucratic, especially if you're illiterate, as much of the population with these kinds of names may be. There are some examples of some of these kinds of names. They're unpleasant or derogatory in some way. The names were probably given 200 or 300 years ago, but they've been kept ever since, but now attempts to change them. So he's been helping with this kind of thing. There are reports for example, of women refusing to marry men that have these kinds of names. So again, he's trying to improve social situation. Okay, and my final example then is an attempt to address some issues of gender discrimination. So in 2011, 285 girls in an inland rural district of Maharashtra received certificates with their new names from the local district officials. The hope was to give these girls new dignity and to help fight the widespread gender discrimination very evident in this part of the state. Gender discrimination, worse health comes, and so on in this area. So the names that they replaced included names that are like Nakus or Nakushi, unwanted, for example, in Hindi. So the girls got to choose their names. So for example, they chose good characteristics or Bollywood stars and so on. They were probably all named at birth by grandfathers who were disappointed in the birth of a granddaughter than a grandson. And this renaming ceremony was the idea of the district health officer in this area with a clear goal of improving health outcomes, both mental and physical, for these girls. So proof that names do matter, names can be one of the social determinants of health. So I hope this brief tour of names and naming patterns in India, with excursions into the rich history, the many facets of diversity, the decolonization and contemporary trends, has helped raise your awareness of the rich possibilities for onomastic research in India. That was my main goal, just to let you know something about India and how much is going on that is of interest. So thanks for your attention. And of course, I'd be happy to take questions. And I have 3 slides of bibliography, which I'm going to kind of rotate around a bit so that you can copy down anything you're interested in, or you can email me if you want the bibliography. So thanks very much. And over to Grant, I guess.
Well, I think we need to welcome questions.